And finally, one more thing that we'll conclude with, which obviously is also relevant to this topic that we have here, which is the topic of slavery. Slavery. Now, in that time, all nations were practicing slavery, but what we mean by slavery, we have to be very specific about when we use the word slavery. It was considered normal in that time for huge empires, large empires, the strong, to just go into a region, capture thousands and thousands, if not millions of people, enslave them and bring them back and make them live in a life of bondage. This was something that was basically normal. All nations were doing this. Persians, Romans, the Byzantines, the whatever nations going back, in history, all nations were basically doing this. And so amongst the Arabs there would be, slaves. Now when Islam came, and there are actually certain hadith in this regard as well, we see that contrary to the propaganda and the lies, again, of those hateful Islamophobic, those who hate Islam for ideological reasons, and the lies that they spread, contrary to what is spread, we see that in Islam there is not a single text in the Quran or the Sunnah that commands taking people slaves in this way. Rather, in fact, there are hadith which actually prohibit the likes of this. Meaning, as in someone is just living their life, whatever, you just go and just kidnap them and make them into slaves. This is prohibited. This is not allowed. And so what we see instead in the Quran is that we see in the religious text, we see hundreds of texts encouraging the freeing of slaves, but not a single text encouraging or commanding the taking of slaves in the way that people would take slaves. That was customary for people and for nations to take slaves in the way that they used to do, because that is oppression, it is tyranny, it is injustice. So Islam came to restrict all of the ways by which a person is held under captivity, with the exception. And so what did Islam, how did it restrict it? It restricted it to, we see that in Islam, the captives of war. When a person is taken captive by way of war. So when we speak about Islam and slavery, we are speaking mainly about war captives. War captives. And this should not be confused with slavery as we know, as was practiced by the Europeans and the Romans and other than them, taking whole nations of people, sticking them on boats, half of them die, putting them in chains in another country on plantations and whatever else. This is not what we mean by slavery. We are speaking here of war captives. And war captives, when a person is taken as a captive, as part of the realities and necessities of war, then in Islam there are regulations for these war captives. They are to be fed, they are to be looked after, they have certain rights, they are to be honoured. There's a whole body of law in relation to how these people are to be treated. Even in the Quran mentions the virtue of those who feed the poor, the needy, and the asir, the captive, the war captive. And in fact, we find to such a degree that one of the war captives from the Mushrikun, he mentions how that when he was captured, I believe in one of the battles, I believe it was Badr, and he mentions how that when he was captured, the Prophet's companions would be throwing bread to him. Every single one of them was certainly would be throwing their bread to him to let him eat first. And each time he would be embarrassed and he'd throw it back. And each time they'd throw it back again. Right? To illustrate how the companions were with a war captive because of what they had been commanded in the Quran and by the messengers to look after the war captive. So when we look at things from this angle, we see that we can pierce through the lies, the fabrications of those liars and those haters who try to spread lies about Islam, and all the time we see them taking things out of context, and it's all distortions and fabrications. So we see that in Islam there's no such thing as capturing whole nations and tribes and enslaving them. And this does not exist. And in Islam, there's no command to this. Rather, all the texts in the Quran and Sunnah are to do with encouraging the freeing of slaves. But there's an element there where there are captives which are involved, but this is part and parcel of the necessity of war, and there's a body of law that exists to regulate that, and they have to be treated in a certain way.